Hi, it's Alex. Let's take a look at the Bible arcing method when it comes to the narrative portions of Scripture. How do we arc narrative? Because a lot of the Bible is in narrative form, and arcing can help us in a variety of ways, even in this particular challenge of the narrative portions of Scripture. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that you're going to see a lot of coordinate relationships, series of events, progressions of events. That's not all you're going to see. However, it's still helpful as an exercise to understand that even in the narrative sections, the writer has a flow of thought that we're trying to recognize and follow. So let me give you a few examples of this. The first one I want to give you is of Genesis chapter 1. This comes straight out of Daniel Fuller's book, Unity, the Bible, where he lays out how he would arc Genesis chapter 1, the opening creation narrative that's given to us. And he would put the first two verses of Genesis under one arc, an introductory couple of verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then he would label each of the days of creation. So we have 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and day 7, which shows us, again, that the chapter and verse divisions may or may not help us in following the flow of the author's thought, because the 7 days of creation spill over into chapter 2, verse 3. But here, in days 1 through 7, we have a series of days laid out. And so Daniel Fuller would label this as a series of 7 days. And he would draw one arc over the top of those 7 days to represent the series of actions that God took in creating the earth. And then the question becomes for us, what about this relationship right here? Is this another series where we draw an arc over the top of this whole section just as a series? Or is this something like perhaps an action manner or an idea explanation? And I'm going to leave you to puzzle on that. What is this relationship then between verses 1 and 2 and the rest of the days of creation? So that's just one example of beginning to use the Bible arcing method in a narrative section. Let me give you another example from Exodus 19. Another narrative section where there's really a lot of action happening. That in verses 1 through 6, we have Moses going up to the Lord. And then in verses 7 through 8, or 8a, you see Moses coming back down to the people. And then in 8b through 13, you see Moses going up to the Lord. And then in 14 through 15, you see Moses coming back down the mountain. There's a lot of traveling up and down the mountain in chapter 19. And then in verse 16, you see something different. You see Moses and the people traveling to the foot of the mountain to meet with the Lord. And then in 20 through 24, it's interesting. It's a couple of actions. We see the Lord coming down, and then Moses also going up to meet with the Lord. And then at the end of the chapter, you see Moses coming down to speak to the people again. So again, this is just one way of characterizing the narrative of Exodus 19, but it's been helpful for me to get my head around all that's taking place in each of these verses. So then I would just label these as a series of actions that are being taken, all under one arc. But it helps me to remember some of the action that's happening in these verses throughout Exodus chapter 19. So that's just another example of arcing in narrative. Let me show you another example in the book of Ruth. In fact, not just in the book of Ruth, but covering the entire book of Ruth, which is maybe easier than some other books because it's so short, it's so compact. And yet, if you look in any commentaries, they will point you to the truth that there's a lot of intention that goes into the structure and the narrative flow of the book of Ruth. So here's one way that I would offer that we could break down the book of Ruth. In the first 13 verses of the book of Ruth, we see the family going out of Israel. And then in 14 through 22, the family returns, although in a very different way than they went out. In fact, it's a very different family than the family that went out. Then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, we see Ruth going out to the field to glean. And then in 12 through 23, we see her returning from the field after meeting Boaz for the first time. Then in chapter 3, we see Ruth going out to the threshing floor where she meets and appeals to Boaz. And then in 11:18, we see her returning home from the threshing floor from meeting with Boaz. Then in 4:1 through 10, we see Boaz going out to the gate to meet with the elders of the city. And then in 11 through 22, after the blessing of the people, we see Ruth contributing to the line of the elders of Israel, leading, of course, to King David. And so we see this motion of going out and returning, of going out and returning, of going out and returning, of going out and then returning with fruit. That would be one way that we could characterize the book of Ruth that I would suggest. And I would see this not simply as just a simple series, but maybe as a series in couplets where each chapter is divided into a couple of series that seem self-contained and then are also in series with each other. So again, a lot of coordinate relationship and series, or you could argue for a progression moving toward the fruitfulness and the climax leading to King David's lineage there in the book of Ruth. But something else interesting happens when we look at this narrative structure of the book of Ruth. At every intersection here within each chapter, we run into a statement about the Lord right here at these convergence points, not because we've been looking at the micro, but at the macro of each chapter and each structure. In chapter 1, Naomi says, "No, my daughters, it's harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." The hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. So a statement about the Lord. And then in chapter 2, we see this statement in verse 12, "May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel." So there seems to be something intentional here at the center of these first two chapters, and this carries on into chapter 3, where Boaz blesses Ruth and says, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown this last kindness better than the first." So there's a blessing of the Lord right here. And then in chapter 4, we see another blessing. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel." And the blessing goes on. And so it seems like there's an intentionality here. What at first seemed like, well, yeah, maybe there's traveling out and back, traveling out and back, traveling out and back, points us to something that seems very intentional, a statement about the Lord that's at the center of each of these narrative sections. And so that's one way, another example of how Bible arcing can help us to consider the intention of the author's flow of thought, and what the author is trying to communicate here. Let me give you just one more example, this time from the New Testament. This is Matthew chapter 4, the temptation of Christ here. And we know that the Lord was tempted 3 times here. The first temptation, the second temptation, the third temptation. And so we could label right here temptation number 1, temptation number 2, temptation number 3. And this is a series of 3 temptations. And then we have these verses of introduction and the closing verse of this section where Jesus is seen as suffering. He's fasting to the point of true starvation in preparation for this temptation that he's going to endure. And then in verse 11, we see Jesus restored, ministered to by angels who come and restore him to strength. And I suppose feed him is the implication there. And so it seems like, again, we have a series that happens here of events where Jesus is preparing for this temptation. He endures 3 temptations, and then he is restored, strengthened after overcoming this temptation. So again, just a visual way that we can use the Bible arcing method to help us to think about the narrative structure of a passage like Matthew 4 or some of these other examples. And I would encourage you to consider other narrative sections of Scripture and put the Bible arcing method to practice to see what insight you gain from using the Bible arcing method in narrative sections of Scripture as well.